Chapter 7. What makes a beginning? Understanding Kellogg's perspective on his sixth presentation is easy. The clock ran out on him the day before. Sometimes that happens to a speaker, and it makes a perfect case for a Part 2 presentation. And that's pretty much what he said when he stood up to speak. The testimonies seem to be filled from beginning to end with reiterations of the doctrine that works are necessary for the manifestation of faith. Yesterday, I read quite a number of extracts upon this point. I want to read a few more this morning upon the same subject. The Medical Missionary, Extra 1, March 1893, page 29. This talk, given February 13th, is only half as long as the one the day before, and since the topic is similar, we won't be looking at it in as much detail. Because our interest centers primarily around the question of the loud cry, we will focus on that aspect of his presentation. Dr. Kellogg began by re-emphasizing a point he had made before, that good works are called for in the life of the Christian. After a few related comments, he used a quotation from Ellen White that touched on Isaiah 58. He had said earlier, of course, that this chapter's injunctions constitute the prerequisite methodology of the loud cry, just as surely as its promises depict the blessings of the latter rain. That is the core of his position, the central issue we are tracking. So now we join the doctor's sixth session, already in progress. Now we must do works, brethren. There is no doubt about that. There are a great many things depending upon this, not only our own soul's salvation, but the success of the work in which we are engaged. The Lord has entrusted you with talents of means to use to advance His cause, and to bless the needy, and to relieve the destitute. You can do a far greater amount of good with your means than you can do by preaching while you retain your means. Now that applies to every one of us, just in proportion as we have means that we are not using. You can do a far greater amount of good by your means than by preaching while you retain your means. What does that mean? It means that we are to do good with our means in the way described in what I have just been reading. Acts of benevolence, charity, good works. I read to you yesterday that works preach louder than preaching. But I read on. Look over the history of your past life. How many have you blessed with your means? How many hearts have you made grateful by your liberalities? That shows distinctly what is referred to here by doing good with our means. Have you loosed the bands of wickedness? Have you sought to undo the heavy burdens, to let the oppressed go free, and to break every yoke? Have you dealt your bread to the hungry, and brought the poor that were cast out to your house? Have you covered the naked? If you have been rich in these good works, you may claim the promise given in this chapter. On the other hand, if we have not been rich in these good works, then we cannot claim these promises. Then shall thy light break forth, as the morning. This promise, you see, has a condition. If we have been rich in good works, then we may claim these promises. And thine health shall spring forth speedily, and thy righteousness shall go before thee. The glory of the Lord shall be thy reward. Then shalt thou call, and the Lord shall answer. Thou shalt cry, and he shall say, Here I am. And if thou draw out thy soul to the hungry, and satisfy the afflicted soul, then shall thy light rise in obscurity, and thy darkness be as the noonday. And the Lord shall guide thee continually, and satisfy thy soul in drought, and make fat thy bones. And thou shalt be like a watered garden, and like a spring of water, whose waters fail not. I never get tired of reading these texts. There seems to be something grand and new and beautiful in every line every time I read them. There is wonderful meaning in these expressive figures, but I read on. But you are not now entitled to these promised blessings. Then we are not entitled to have our light break forth as the morning, our health healing spring forth speedily, and to have the Lord say, Here I am, when we cry to Him. And so of the rest of these promises. We cannot expect them when we have not complied with the conditions upon which the promises are based. Is not this as plain as anything can be? It is right here. The Bible says it. The testimonies say it. What more evidence do we want? Here again, you are not now entitled to these promised blessings. You have not been engaged in this work. Look back over your past life and consider how destitute it is of good, noble, generous actions. You have talked the truth, but you have not lived it. It is now high time that you were changing your course and working diligently to secure the heavenly treasure. The Medical Missionary, Extra 1, March 1893, page 30. It should be noted that the passage Kellogg is citing here is from a personal testimony written to a specific individual, rather than to the church at large. Thus, the applicability of the passage to the denomination as a whole is a debatable point. Some might say that it doesn't fit. Kellogg obviously said it did. Kellogg noted that the testimony just quoted was written in 1871 and made the point that similar counsels had been given through the years right down to that time. As another example, he cited this passage from 1876. You do not possess a spirit of self-denial that resembles the great exemplar. You should cultivate benevolence, which will bring you more into harmony with the Spirit of Christ in his disinterested benevolence. We cannot cultivate benevolence by praying for benevolence or by talking about benevolence. In order to cultivate benevolence, one must go to work. He must be benevolent. Even if you don't enjoy it very well at first, keep practicing it, and by, you will come to enjoy it better. You will thus cultivate benevolence, and in this way you may, by God's help, get to be benevolent. The Medical Missionary, Extra 1, March 1893, page 31. Kellogg quoted more of this passage from 1876, which deals with the story of the Good Samaritan. Of course, as one interested in working for the poor, this story had a natural appeal to the doctor. Ellen White's comments are, as Kellogg would remark, very pointed and very straight. Here Jesus wished to teach his disciples the moral obligations which are binding upon man to his fellow man. Whoever neglects to carry out the principles illustrated by this lesson is not a commandment keeper, but like the Levite, he breaks the law of God, which he pretends to revere. There are some who, like the Samaritan, make no pretensions to exalted piety, yet who have a high sense of their obligation to their fellow men, and have far more charity and kindness than some who profess great love to God, but fail in good works toward his creatures. These are very pointed remarks. We claim to be commandment keepers because we turn away our foot from the Sabbath. But whoever neglects to carry out the principles illustrated by this lesson is not a commandment keeper. This is very straight talk indeed, and there is more in the testimonies on the subject of benevolence and charity than there is upon any other one question. If you take the subject of Christian benevolence and the subject of health reform and put these two together, you will find there is more said upon these subjects than on any other half-dozen subjects, and yet there is less said about them by our ministers, I fear, than on any other subjects in the whole of these volumes. Now, can't we let our hearts and minds expand a little? The Medical Missionary, Extra 1, March 1893, page 33. If only he could see us now. Kellogg's emphasis on the passing of time and the repetition of testimonies on the same wrongs is interesting to note, if for no other reason than to ponder what he might say now that we are a further century and more downstream. As to his views on the loud cry, he makes himself perfectly plain in this final selection, taken from near the close of his talk. 30 years ago, the Lord gave us a symmetrical system of truth so that we might keep ourselves in health and be thoroughly furnished unto all good works. If we really believe the Lord is going to use us in doing the great work that he has to do in this world, we ought to be hurrying very fast to catch up, for we are fearfully behind. Certainly the Lord is not going to do this work through us while we go on ignoring the instruction that he has been giving us during so many years. We must not imagine that we are going to sound the loud cry while we are ignoring these important truths. The Lord has been giving us these truths that we may make preparation for what is before us. Instead of that, we have been going back into Egypt for years and years. Now listen again. When the advocates of the law of God, that means us, plant their feet firmly upon its principles, showing that they are not merely loyal in name, but loyal at heart, carrying out in their daily lives the spirit of God's commandments, that is the same as what is said of the Good Samaritan, and exercising true benevolence to man, that does not mean to do a little for a man, in order that we may present some of our denominational views. We should begin to do good because we love Christ. Then will they have moral power to move the world. We shall never have the moral power to move the world. We shall never see the loud cry, nor make the third angel's message go to any great extent. We will never see it go so as to move the world, at least, until we carry out these truths in our daily lives. It is impossible for those who profess allegiance to the law of God to correctly represent the principles of that sacred decalogue while slighting its holy injunctions to love their neighbor as themselves. It means a good deal to love our neighbor as ourselves. Again, the most eloquent sermon that can be preached upon the 10 Commandments is to do them. The words "do them" in this testimony are printed in italics, and what it means to do them is plainly taught in the parable of the Good Samaritan. The singular absence of principle that characterizes the lives of many professed Christians is alarming. Their disregard of God's law disheartens those who recognize its sacred claims and tends to turn those from the truth who would otherwise accept it. That is, the fact that we do not do this work turns people away from the truth. How can we expect to see the loud cry drawing people to the truth when our actions are such as to drive them away from the truth? Let the world see that we are not selfishly narrowed up to our own exclusive interests and religious joys, but that we are liberal and desire them to share our blessings and privileges through the sanctification of the truth. Let them see that the religion which we profess does not close up nor freeze over the avenues to the soul, making us unsympathizing and exacting. Let all who profess to have found Christ minister as he did to the benefit of man, cherishing a spirit of wise benevolence. Now that is pretty large. We shall then see many souls following the light that shines from our precept and example. Now the loud cry will not go until we do this. It is as plain as anything can be that the great development of this work is not going to take place until our light shines, until we let our light shine by our good works. The Medical Missionary, Extra 1, March 1893, pages 33 through 34. Dr. Kellogg gave 2 more presentations at the General Conference session that year. We will look briefly at them in the next chapter, but since neither of them so directly addresses the issue of the loud cry, we'll put their consideration off for a while so we can do a little debriefing on what we've covered thus far. There are any number of interesting inquiries that might come out of Kellogg's talks, but they can easily be generalized enough so as to fall into 2 basic areas. The larger scope issues center around the validity of his major premise. If he was right about medical missionary work forming a necessary element of the Lord's work in general and of the loud cry in particular, then there are profound implications for Adventist history, education, evangelism, missiology, and eschatology. Given a little reflection, it's hard to imagine any element of Adventism that wouldn't be affected to some degree, and if Kellogg was right, some of these areas could easily be seen as ripe for a major overhaul. But before embarking on any considerations so vast, there is, as it were, a sentinel issue which must be addressed, a roadblock that can be seen as entirely negating any need for such revisionist pursuits. This, of course, is the obvious discrepancy between Ellen White and John Harvey Kellogg. She said the loud cry had begun. He said it couldn't have because the church wasn't anywhere close to meeting the conditions. It takes no great imagination to see those two positions as locked in irreconcilable contradiction. For Kellogg's thesis, this is a huge problem, since so much of its supporting evidence is drawn straight from Ellen White. It would be more than a little hypocritical to reject her authority on the one point while building so much of his case on her writings. Of course, for many people with a cursory knowledge of Adventist history, the whole idea of believing Kellogg is preposterous from the get-go. Come on! The guy was a pantheist. But this is an example of a little knowledge being a dangerous thing. Another cliché that fits well is, timing is everything. The Kellogg of 1893 was a far cry from the Kellogg of a decade and more later. Plus, there are a few twists and turns to Kellogg's story in the early 1900s that bring complexity to the issue. We'll consider these in later chapters. So, we are left with the question of Kellogg's belief in the gift of prophecy through Ellen White. To be blunt, in a general sort of way, we might ask whether or not Kellogg believed Ellen White. Or more specifically, as the voice in the meeting had said, "Don't you think the loud cry has commenced?" By the time one has waded through his first 6 meetings, it's hard to conclude that Kellogg believed the loud cry had begun. But when he was asked point-blank whether or not he thought the loud cry has commenced, his answer was not no. Instead, his first words were, "I don't know. I am presenting this subject of medical missionary work from my standpoint." The Medical Missionary, Extra 1, March 1893, page 28. How could he not know unless he didn't believe Ellen White's plain statement? Logic would seem to preclude any other conclusion, but we are, after all, talking about a living, breathing human being, one probably with at least as much emotion and pride and prejudice as most of the rest of us. Sometimes logic fails to capture the essence of our positions and decisions, and there is good reason to think that may have been the case here. For starters, in the 1890s, Kellogg was known as an ardent supporter of Ellen White. None other than former General Conference President George I. Butler wrote to Kellogg in 1906 to remind him of those days, saying, "I used to say sometimes I thought the doctor believed the testimonies more than he did the Bible." Letter G.I. Butler to J.H. Kellogg, March 7, 1906. A similar testimony to Kellogg's belief in the testimonies was written many years later by Percy McGann, then the recently elected president of the College of Medical Evangelists, now Loma Linda University. When McGann assumed the presidency in 1928, one of the issues he had to face was the offering of internships to CME graduates by the Battle Creek Sanitarium and Hospital. Kellogg's influence being unacceptable, the practice had to end. Some things are best dealt with in person, so McGann ended up making a trip back to Michigan. He later wrote an account of the interview with Kellogg and Dr. B.N. Culver, a sanitarium physician. For our purposes, it is only the comments about Kellogg's past that matter. McGann: I well remember the day when you used to stand on top of a table in the old gymnasium with tears streaming down your face, telling the helpers, of whom I was one, what a wonderful thing God's gift to this people through Ellen G. White was. I have heard you read from her writings by the hour and talk in a most earnest and subdued way about the wonderful spiritual insight that she had and how much it all meant to you. In an earlier day, you made impressions upon my life. Kellogg: Well, McGann, whenever I made those statements which you referred to, I always qualified them. Culver: No, Dr. Kellogg, you did not always qualify them. You did not qualify them at all. You believed them with all your heart, and there are scores of people who can rise up to witness to that. Letter P.T. McGann to W.A. Spicer, August 6, 1928. When Kellogg said, "I don't know," he certainly wasn't implying any total or sudden loss of confidence in Ellen White. After all, he had spent much of that 5th meeting quoting her. And the next day, he went right back at it again. But how could he believe in her prophetic role and say, "I don't know," when asked if he thought what she had said was true? The simple answer is he was confused. More learned expositions on cognitive dissonance and reality distortion might be offered, but confusion should suffice. Not the momentary kind of confusion that comes and goes, but a deeper confusion, fueled perhaps by some of the most basic weaknesses of human nature. Put yourself in the doctor's place. The causes he championed, basically health reform and Christian benevolence, were clearly supported by both the Bible and the spirit of prophecy. He had been supported in these 2 points by Ellen White for years. His case that they were necessary for the finishing of God's work was, at least in his own estimation, unimpeachable. The ministers were, unfortunately, among the most influential elements of resistance to what he knew to be right. And he was supposed to believe that the blessing of the loud cry was being poured out upon the church through their ministration, while they continued to ignore or oppose the genuinely self-sacrificing work that he and his associates were doing. Ellen White's description of his case, though given at a later date, points back to this time and helps explain the difficult position he was in. In a letter dated February 22nd, 1899, she would write this: "The Lord has greatly exalted and blessed his servant, Dr. Kellogg. He has used him to honor his name upon the earth and to give character to the work." Dr. Kellogg has been obtaining a most precious experience, but there are some who have acted as though they had been appointed to work against him. The Lord has reproved their course of action. They knew not that they were working on Satan's side of the question. As men and women have thus worked out their own attributes, this has been a hindrance to the doctor. His brethren have had evidence that he has been working in accordance with the will of God. But although they have had light on this point, they have not all stood by his side to help him. Some have held up his hands, but others have not heeded the admonitions given. Those who refused the warnings of God followed a course of action which brought its sure result. These influences have sometimes made the work of Dr. Kellogg doubly as hard as it should have been. They have led him to stand apart to some degree from the ministry. I desire to present matters as they are presented to me. Such a spirit of criticism and fault-finding has done the work Satan designed should be done. Dr. Kellogg has been led to take the course he deemed it his duty to take. He has not connected with those who were not in sympathy with the work he knew to be of God. Battle Creek Letters, page 14. We might surmise that in 1893, Kellogg had experienced some or all of this already. Of course, this wasn't written until 6 years later, so Kellogg didn't have the advantage of this insight at the time. Even then, it should be pointed out, this letter wasn't written to Kellogg. He probably had no need to hear this kind of endorsement, or to know that it had been written to others. He was, after all, very human and had problems enough with pride. Notice especially the last 2 sentences of the quotation. Kellogg knew his work was of God, and so he followed the course he deemed it his duty to take. Was he wrong in either of these points? It seems extremely difficult to believe that Ellen White would say that he was mistaken in his opinion of his work, and only slightly more likely that he incorrectly deemed what was his duty. The description given by Ellen White will no doubt inspire some readers with a sense of déjà vu. The challenge of staying faithful to truth in the face of opposition from one's brethren, without losing all patience with them and leaving the church, is more severe a test than most are called to endure. Biblically, we might think of Job, Joseph, and Jesus as examples of those who passed this test. And it's not only names starting with J. Paul wasn't always treated the best by his brethren either. See Sketches from the Life of Paul, page 226, and Acts of the Apostles, pages 400 through 406. In Adventist history, we find another J, James White, who dealt with similar struggles. Then, of course, A.T. Jones and E.J. Waggoner Both faced persecution from the saints, but with less happy outcomes. It's safe to say that this kind of friendly fire opposition is one of the hardest tests that God's workers are called to endure. This is the kind of confusion behind Kellogg's "I don't know" response. How well would you have handled it? If that was wrong, what was right? It's easy and appropriate for those with no particular grasp of the circumstances to say that when Ellen White wrote that the loud cry had begun, she meant just that. But the answer of simple faith can still leave us far short of the understanding that God would have us gain. Faith and understanding both play an important role in the Christian life. It is not right for either to banish the other. Unchallenged faith produces ignorance and intellectual sloth, consider the Dark Ages, for example, while the exaltation of understanding inevitably leads astray, consider the Enlightenment, for example. Christian maturity requires that both be employed in harmony, despite the appearance of mutual exclusivity. And in this case, there were plenty of questions raised by the announcement of the loud cry. What about Isaiah 58? Are there no conditions implied by that chapter's 2 ifs and 3 thens? What of Christ's example of spending more time in healing than in preaching? Is that not for us to follow? What about all the verses talking about widows and orphans? Are they just junk DNA in the genetic code of Scripture? And what about Ellen White's other comments, the ones calling for the church to take up the medical missionary work? How was Kellogg to reconcile all these unfulfilled duties with the idea that the end of all things was at hand? Did that mean that all those other things were just options rather than necessities? If so, what would that say about the very nature of the great controversy? More on that in a later chapter. Further prayer, study, and thought may provide a better answer someday. But at the very least, it's worth pointing out that neither Kellogg nor his questioners seem to have paid close attention to the wording of Ellen White's famous statement. The time of test is just upon us, for the loud cry of the third angel has already begun in the revelation of the righteousness of Christ, the sin-pardoning Redeemer. This is the beginning of the light of the angel, whose glory shall fill the whole earth. Review and Herald, November 22nd, 1892. Notice begun and beginning. Here is perhaps the core of Kellogg's difficulty. He seems to have never differentiated between the level of compliance with the conditions of Isaiah 58 that would be required to start the loud cry and the level of compliance necessary to finish it. He came close, at least once. Brother Jones may be right in thinking that the time has come for the loud cry to begin, but if the loud cry has been begun by our people, it must be because we have just begun to do a little in the way of letting our light shine. The Medical Missionary, Extra 1, March 1893, page 28. Apparently the if-because connection of his comment seemed too remote to take seriously. But why should it have? It actually fit the circumstances perfectly. Ellen White had said the loud cry had begun, but the rest of the world wouldn't have known it. It's not like our evangelistic efforts had suddenly become vastly more successful. Adventists weren't on the front pages of any of the world's great newspapers. The loud cry had begun, but only just barely. Proportionately, the medical missionary work had barely gotten going, but it was beginning. The irony of all this is that Kellogg, often accused of self-promotion, was failing to take much credit for the work he had championed. The orphanage, the visiting nurses, the Christian help bands started up around the country. They all owed their existence to Kellogg and the workers at the sanitarium. Perhaps it was the desire for acceptance from the church that led him to miss the connection. After all, if the church wasn't acknowledging the medical missionary work, how could it be considered effective? Kellogg had a tendency toward the big and grandiose. Perhaps he was just unable to imagine anything as significant as the loud cry coming from such a humble showing as the medical missionary work had produced so far. Or maybe he felt slighted, he surely had been, and was looking for an apology before he could view the church as worthy of any special blessing. Perhaps it was all this and more. Whatever the cause, Kellogg never followed up on his "because we have just begun to do a little" statement. Others, of course, never followed up on it either, but that was because they had overlooked Ellen White's use of the term revelation and the whole sentence about the light of the angel whose glory shall fill the whole earth. The loud cry, she intimated, was something that was shown and demonstrated. Many were more comfortable with a gospel consisting exclusively of proclamation. A gospel of that sort, though, was foreign to the Lord's work and totally inadequate for the need. The work that the great teacher did in connection with his disciples is the example we are to follow. It is only by an unselfish interest in those in need of help that we can give a practical demonstration of the truths of the gospel. The Lord will give you success in this work, for the gospel is the power of God unto salvation when it is interwoven with the practical life, when it is lived and practiced. The union of Christ-like work for the body and Christ-like work for the soul is the true interpretation of the gospel. Review and Herald, March 4, 1902. No false or faulty gospel will finish the task at hand. At the end of time, nothing but the unadulterated true interpretation will suffice. And the glory that fills the whole earth? We shall see the medical missionary work broadening and deepening at every point of its progress because of the inflowing of hundreds and thousands of streams until the whole earth is covered as the waters cover the sea. Medical Ministry, page 317. Perhaps the care provided at the Haskell home, the sacrifices of the visiting nurses in Chicago, and the good works of the Christian help bands weren't overwhelming. Neither is a stream, but put hundreds and thousands of them together, and you're eventually going to end up with an ocean. Perhaps there was no one, medical or ministerial, who was prepared to accept and promote the final gospel in its simplicity and its humility. Kellogg saw the need for the practical ministry, but wanted a respected corps of medical missionaries based in imposing medical facilities, making a stir in the world. The ministers generally saw no need for any of that, but preferred a sole emphasis on the fine art of preaching. To use a military analogy, one still had an attachment to fancy uniforms, expensive equipment, and dress parades, while the other wanted to fight a war with only the Air Force. Time and reality seem bent on teaching us that, along with the proclamation of those flying in the midst of heaven, there is a necessity for boots on the ground, a whole army of privates in dirty fatigues down in the mud and the blood, fighting the war the same way Jesus fought it.